We've been speaking about self-love, love for God. What about one's relationship with children? And one's relationship with children, as they grow and develop and mature, the level of relationship continuously changes. As a child, a parent normally loves a child. It's literally inborn. As we mentioned, there's a special innate love that a parent has for a child, because if not for that love, the child wouldn't be cared for, because it's not easy to raise a child. And as the child gets older, the child begins understanding. The child has certain sensitivities. Years ago, there was a book written by two women psychologists, child psychologists. They explained that whenever you punish a child and a child has to be disciplined, the punishment should be immediately after the child does the wrong thing. Of course, the only level of connection a child has is by association. Understanding the nature of what's wrong, child doesn't have the capacity to understand why what he or she did was wrong. But if the disciplinary action is immediately associated with the action, the child will understand whatever was done was unacceptable. Otherwise, the child's confused. Why is my parent punishing me or denying me? So there has to be some kind of level within the context of the child's understanding why the punishment is associated with what? With the misbehavior. But as the child gets older, as King Solomon says, spare the rod, spoil the child. You can't spoil the child rotten. If the child does the wrong thing, and despite that, you give the child has no understanding that the consequences for misbehavior or incentives for good behavior. Therefore, a person has to be very selective what he does and what he doesn't do. And the times that even when the child doesn't deserve, if the child feels that he's being mistreated for whatever reason, even though it's unfounded, sometimes a parent has to look away and do even more to give that child that sense of love. It's really, you need so much insight and understanding, and even more than anything, what we call Siyata, divine assistance when you raise a child. There's so many things emotionally, mentally, and external, internal, which the child sees and experiences, which may actually cause the child to dysfunction. And life is a balance, and it's not simple. It's interesting. Many years I used to meet many people, and the majority of people that I met, I couldn't care how successful they were in business, they suffered from self-esteem. That was a problem, because when you speak to them one-to-one, on a personal level, there was a lack of self-esteem. And that's why they sought out attention, or that's why they were arrogant, or that's why they were pompous, or they were self-centered, or they had this dominating personality. It's only because there was this level of insecurity, therefore they had to compensate for it with all this other stuff. But a person who's comfortable with himself, he doesn't need acknowledgement, he doesn't need validation. Everybody needs a pat on the back once in a while, but basically, if you know who you are and you know you're in the right place and you're secure with yourself and you have that confidence, the confidence is not arrogance. The confidence is because you know you're in a good place. Whether people agree with you, don't agree with you, it doesn't make a difference, because you know you're in the right place. But people, they confuse many things with many other things. They may take it as arrogance. How can you be so confident when other people are worried about these things? Are you out to lunch? No. Of course, this person knows exactly, because he was mentored or he has a level of understanding or grasp. He's not interested in these other things. It's interesting. People, they raise children without religion, Jews, and the child somehow has a fancy, he gets an interest in religion, goes to Israel, studies, and the parents are concerned that maybe the child's going off the deep end. Here, the child was raised normal, and all of a sudden, the child's assuming these archaic concepts and behavior patterns, which we don't do anymore. And they send the child to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And they speak to their friends. They said, you don't have to worry, it's a passing phase. It's part of growing up. Your child doesn't come around. So the friends know better than the parents. Just as the friends abandoned Judaism and abandoned the tradition of their parents or their grandparents, so they're advising them, it's a passing phase. We were that way at one time also. But it's not a passing phase necessarily. Very often, the child really has come upon something which is real and meaningful, and everything else doesn't mean anything. And one thing he says is very important. Children speak out of turn. I'm talking teenagers or young adults. And sometimes you have to bite your tongue. You have to behave, he says, as if you're hard of hearing. Because if you react to that unacceptable comment, you react to that child, you can destroy the child or drive the child out of the house. Therefore, for the sake of the child and your love for the child, you remain silent. Don't say anything. Because what comes through to a child, whether you understand, doesn't understand, my father, my mother never abandoned me. Despite my behavior, they always loved me. They never sent me off. They always valued me. Regardless whether it was to the liking, not the liking, they were always there for me. And that stays with a child throughout his life. And that's something you never forget. Because everything in life is identity. Identity doesn't mean you identify in the same context of behavior, but identify with my parents, their home, their backing. That you identify with. Not going to record this. The Rambam rules and laws of Talmud Torah that a parent, the father, has an obligation to teach his son Torah. Based on a verse in the Torah. What about a person who's knowledgeable in Torah? What is his obligation to a third party's child? So based on the verse, the first portion of the Shema, we read the Shinantim Bonecho. You should teach Bonecho, teach your children, and based on a biblical interpretation, Bonecha Elu Talmidecho. Bonecha means your students. That if you have Torah knowledge to pass on, you have an obligation to mentor another person's child in Torah. Shinantim Bonecho. Okay. So the Rambam writes that a person who's a chacham, he has knowledge, chayav lamed es hatalmidim. You must teach the students. So I ask the question, you only become a student after you're taught. What do you mean you're obligated to teach the students? So it's clear, what does it mean you're obligated to teach students? That if a person has an interest in studying, to be the recipient of what you have to offer, then you have an obligation to serve that need. What about if the child, this person is not interested? Do I have an obligation to convince him as a teacher that he should accept it, that he should be receptive to the Torah I have to offer? Seems from the Rambam, no. If you're willing to be a Talmud, a student, I have an obligation to service you. But if you don't have no interest in being a student, have no obligation. What about if it's your child? If it's your child, you have an obligation to teach him Torah. You bring a child into this world, as you have a responsibility to raise him in all physical amenities. You have to raise him, you're responsible for his spiritual development. And the ultimate spiritual development is based upon what? The study of Torah. That's the father's obligation to his son. Whether the son's interested or not, the father has to leave no stone unturned to convince the child and to appreciate what he has to offer. A third party's child, if there's an interest, I have an obligation to deliver. If he has no interest, I have no obligation whatsoever. There's a separate responsibility. Jews are responsible for one another, but not as a Torah scholar do I have an obligation to teach that person. As a Jew, I have to be concerned to try to encourage him to be interested. But in terms of, because what I possess, I have to share with him, I have no obligation to share that with him. But for a child, it's irrelevant. You're obligated to teach that child because he's your son. So again, you see the same thing. The level of responsibility that a parent that's incumbent upon a parent is not incumbent on one Jew on another Jew. It's a whole different reality. And again, it's because one of the reasons is because a child to a parent is more than a third party to another person. Because the interest of a parent is the child, always. And the parent hopefully will succeed. Whether it's incentives, whether it's other ways to approach the child, to get the child interested. But that all emanates from Ava B'no. That's the love that a parent has, the natural love that a parent has to a child. Children in their formative years, you have an obligation. Of all living species, the only species that without tender care, that species will not survive. An animal gives birth naturally within a day or two, or a very short period of time. That offspring is independent. A human being, that if the needs of that child are not attended to immediately, the child's going to die. The child has to be fed, has to be cared for, it has to be cleaned, has to be whatever it is. Nothing comes natural. It's all the external investment in that child will allow that child to develop normally. Otherwise, an animal develops naturally, normally, instinctively. It's in its habitat, the way God created this world. It's able to develop, grow, and become independent of its parent. It doesn't make a difference. A human being, no, needs the parent, or needs someone who's the equivalent of the parent to assume responsibility for that child in every sense of the word, to protect the child. As you say, even for a number of years, even until adulthood, but up to a point where the child now should really function independent. Parent has no obligation. Whether the parent does it or not, that's a separate discussion. But as an obligation, a parent has no obligation to that child. The times now, the child is obligated to the parent, honoring a parent, providing for a parent. The parents are able to provide for themselves.
That's a constant in terms of honor.
The constant of child is not supposed to honor the parent, because every moment of the child's life, the child's only there because the parent brought that child into existence. That's why the child has a constant obligation till the day he dies to honor his parent, father, and mother. A parent, what's his basis for his obligation to the child? Because I brought you into existence. Once you're independent, self-sufficient, now you're on your own. Parent no longer has an obligation. I have an obligation to bring you to a point. Now that you can function responsibly, now you're on your own. The Mishnah tells us that a parent has to teach a child Torah, has to circumcise a child, redeem a child, teach him Torah, teach him a craft. He should have a livelihood. A parent has an obligation to teach his child how to swim. Because if you don't know how to swim and you're in a situation, God forbid, his life's in jeopardy. So whatever parent could provide for the child, as a young person, you have to do that to secure the child, and now the child can function independent of the parent. But once you've done that, you've done. You want to go beyond that, that's your prerogative. But as an obligation, you no longer have an obligation. But a child to a parent, that obligation is continuous, because as long as you're alive, your existence is only because your parents brought you into the existence. October 7th in Israel. When a Jewish parent raises a child, it's not, he has another bambino, right? You know that bambino. Your child is a mainstay in your life. the way a Jewish parent raises a child, whether it's caring for him, educating, beliefs, and the way a Jewish parent raises a child, it's not like, you bring a child and you send them off and let them graze in the pasture. It's not that. A Jewish parent takes a special interest in the child. And this whole concept of family is very integrated in the psyche and the function of a child. You send the child to war, God forbid, and the child comes back wounded, paraplegic, traumatized, where the child can't function, or the child's killed, God forbid. How devastating is the parent? You'd say a child dies of an illness. Say, you understand, it happens. That's God related, so to say. But if a person's child life is taken, it's not simple. That means somebody went who didn't value life sufficiently and took that person's life. Like, God forbid, a person on a holdup for $10, God forbid, is able to kill a person. That murderer, what's his value of life? If you could take a life for $10, the answer is that person doesn't value life. Because if you value life, there's no way you could take someone's life for $10. The answer, you don't value that person's life. The parent who raised that child, what's the value of that child's life? It's not only monetarily what the parent put into that child to raise him, to educate him. It's that person's soul is connected to the soul of the child. It's like a part of the parent no longer exists when that child is lost. It's a whole different reality. My parents, some of you knew my parents, some didn't know my parents. I had a very special relationship with my mother and father. Went through a lot of things. They didn't always have money. Things weren't easy, but I never knew things weren't easy. They always shielded us from many things. We felt no different than any other child. And I felt a debt of gratitude to my parents, that I felt my sense of value, self-value, was because of the way they valued me. Because they used to say, there's nothing that you can't do as long as you put your mind to it. That's it. They gave me that sense of self-value, that confidence. And I appreciated it. And I succeeded because of it. And when I was married, almost every Shabbos, when I lived no longer in Baltimore, I'd have my parents at my home for Shabbos. And my children saw the way we treated my parents. And because they saw the way I treated my parents, they had a special relationship with their grandparents. Their grandmother and grandfather were special to them. And grandparents who see grandchildren who love them, they even love them even more. And the relationship was not to be believed how special it was. And it just carries on from one generation to the next. But if the parents don't treat their parents respectfully, and they're always too busy for the parents, the children are too busy for their parents. That's the way it works. Everything in life is role modeling. That's what it is. My grandmother came to the United States with 4 children and her husband in 1921-22. They came from Hungary, Romania. And my grandmother, her oldest son was 10 years old. My mother was 2 years old. And my grandmother was widowed at the age, my mother was 12 years old. So in 1932, 33, my grandmother had to raise 4 children on her own. Wasn't simple. And she was a very strong personality, very independent. And she took the bull by its horns, and she took care of every one of her children, whether it was putting them through school, whether supporting them, giving them a sense of confidence, providing for them, lending them money to be able to go into business, whatever it was. That's the way she was. And I was raised with my grandmother, and there was nobody more important to her than her children and grandchildren. Of course, she had her favorites among children and grandchildren, but everybody was important to her. And if she could do anything for us, she would do it for us. And we would do for her. My grandmother had 15 grandchildren. And every one of them, we ranged from ages. I had some cousins that were maybe 20 years older than I was. But it doesn't make a difference. The older, the younger, they all valued my grandmother the same way. Again, because the way she showed her concern that for us, it was reciprocal relationship. That's what it was. And the dedication of the children to their mother was something not to be believed because they appreciated it. The children of my grandmother used to say, we're four, but each of us are not even a quarter of our mother. She encapsulates, and whatever we are, she's all of us combined plus more. That's the way they valued her. So they had her on a pedestal. She was like the matriarch of the family. People would come and strangers would consult with her about many things because she was a very wise woman. So if we saw strangers consulting with her, here we had her in our so-called in our backyard. We're not going to consult with her, value her. Yeah. He was a boy in the Midwest. And I remember, everybody lives up to somebody's expectations. Expectations is very important. I remember when I was in 6th grade, I had an English teacher. His name was Harry Klein, 6th grade. And he taught us a number of subjects, and he himself was an English principal in a public school. And after those days, when public school was over, these people would come and teach in the yeshiva. Because secular subjects were taught in the afternoon, the yeshivas. The morning were Hebrew subjects. They would come in the afternoon. And this person, Harry Klein, he was a very Jewish teacher, very Jewish, but he wasn't observant. But he had his favorite students. And I was one of his favorites. And he gave me a sense of value also that there's nothing that I can't do. He believed in me, and I excelled. In my studies, I excelled because of that. Because if somebody has expectations and allows you to believe in yourself, you're motivated to succeed. But a person who's put down, you're a nothing, you're going to be a nothing. Because you are a nothing, regardless of the capacity of that child, the child is going nowhere. Because if a person doesn't believe in himself, so where's he going? He gives up. So I remember there was a boy in Midwest. Could you imagine? His family name was Paris. It was an observant family. And his first name, he had a nickname. They called him Putzi Paris. Could you imagine? Putzi Paris. And his parents said, something? He went to the Hebrew Academy in St. Louis, this person. His parents says, something? Someday when you get old, you're going to pump gas on the corner gas station. That's what they told him. Could you imagine? Jewish parents telling a kid he's going to pump gas. What do you think he turned out to be? He was a gas station attendant. He pumped gas at a gas station. If they would have told him, we believe in you, you have the capacity, you have this and that, he would have been probably a different kid. And he always walked around, with his head sunken between his shoulders. That's where he was. He walked around like the whole world was on his shoulders. Because he was never given the ability to believe in himself. And he had no value, he had no self-value. Suffered from self-esteem not to be believed.